Greetings once again from Bead 326. For the last week of class, we're going to look at one of the most influential events in the history of the world, which is the French Revolution. And it got started in 1789. And later on, when people look back at the French Revolution, they would say it stood for three ideals: liberty, equality, and fraternity. And that's the slogan which we've seen in the PowerPoint on Versailles and the Conciergerie. That's located on many French buildings, and it's on the back of the French euro coin: liberty, equality, and fraternity. So, coming from the French Revolution is this notion that the ideal society is going to feature these three qualities. Now, as you've seen if you've done the study guide on chapter 21, the revolution perhaps starts out to achieve these, but it ends up going into a very radical stage, which we'll talk about later on, which called into question, these three ideals, because the radicals believed that they could be suspended in order to achieve what they thought a great society should look like. So, here we have the way French society was constructed coming out of the Middle Ages. There were three estates. The first estate was the clergy, so that's Roman Catholic only, after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, which we've learned about before, something Louis XIV did. So the clergy took care of your religious needs, cradle to grave, so to speak. What they got from the nobility is the right to operate in their churches, and on the land that the nobility owned, the third estate produced the food that fed these two estates. So the second estate offered military protection for the first and the third estates in the event of war. And so the idea was there were a mutual set of understandings on how the three estates would work, which made a lot of sense maybe in the year 1400. But in the modern nation state of France, the need to reform this was becoming quite evident. Now, we want to make sure we understand that the first and second estates were considered privileged orders. And I'll just use one example to illustrate that point. Let's say you were in the French military and you wanted to become an officer. You wanted to make it a career. You could not become an officer in the French military unless you were a member of the second estate. So someone from the third estate might be more qualified, might be more talented, but they could never become an officer because they did not belong to this particular social group. So that's an example of the way in which these first two estates were privileged orders. Now, what happens in the 1780s, and some of this is covered in the chapter, is a series of bad harvests. And as we learned previously, the French ate on an average of 2 pounds of bread per person per day. And so there were bread shortages, and people were starving. Some bakers were throwing sawdust into the flour to stretch it out. And then the country was also deeply in debt because it had helped finance the American Revolution. So what happens then is they have to put in place their process for trying to reform the country. So in 1788, King Louis XVI makes a decision that the Estates General will meet and attempt to introduce some reforms into France. Now, here's the rub of the matter. As set up, if they followed the old rules, each estate, as you see here, had one vote. So if they met and followed those rules, obviously the first and second estate estates could always have their way if they voted in a block. And so there was all kinds of talk as to what would happen when the Estates General met. Some people were saying that they should just have any representative to the Estates General, regardless of which estate, have one vote. And they had some things that they could look at. So 1789, for example, was the year that the U.S. Constitution went into effect. So they could look at that as a model. And they could also look to a country like England, which had a limited monarchy and a parliament that was supreme. So those were some of the issues as France headed into what became the tumultuous first year of the French Revolution, 1789.